Seekers Podcast. I am Tiffany Gaines, the host of the Seekers Podcast. Let's go ahead on and hit the subscribe button for notifications of any new videos uploaded to the channel. I do appreciate the listen, the comments, and the support thus far. Chris Paul and Scott Foster, referee Scott Foster. Chris Paul needs no introduction. Scott Foster May, if you're not an NBA fan, is a referee who, admittedly, by Chris Paul, they have personal beef. And apparently, some time ago, I don't know which team, what era of Chris's career, because he's been playing long enough to have eras, allegedly, Scott Foster said some not so nice things to Chris Paul's son as he was driving out of a parking lot. And I got this information, this take from Gilbert Arenas, and his show and his platform. I love that show. So shout out to Gil's Arena. That Scott Foster yelled out the window, "Get the fuck out of the way," or something inappropriate to Chris Paul's son. And therefore, anytime you address a player's son, and in such a disrespectful way, if that's true, you probably gonna always be a problem until you make that right. But I don't know Scott Foster as a person, but I have heard over the years the rhetoric and the insinuation that Chris Paul's games against when Scott Foster refs those games, a lot of them are losses. And in the playoffs, significantly, I think Scott Foster refed games have had a significant impact on Chris Paul's career. And I don't want to say impact as though I'm condoning or co-signing the narrative that Scott Foster does impact Chris Paul's games for personal reason, other than the fact that the man believes that a foul is being called for or against a team that Chris Paul is on. I have no evidence, and I don't know that I have seen any evidence. I have not seen any evidence where the NBA, and I'm sure they had to have done an investigation by now. For as long as this narrative has gone on, there has to have been an investigation by now into referee Scott Foster to see how inaccurate or polarizing the games that he's called with Chris Paul, if they have been impacted, if the score has been impacted in any way that would prejudice a team that Chris Paul is on. But the thing that they were discussing on Gilbert Arenas' show, his podcast, and I don't know if it's just the opinion of the gentleman on this show, is that Scott Foster should not be allowed to ref any games that Chris Paul is playing. And I get that on the surface. But and the assumption now, especially after this last game that Scott Foster and Chris Paul went in, where it got contentious, Chris Paul was ejected. Uh, Personal comments were said to Scott Foster, and yeah, I'm sure Chris Paul is going to be disciplined by the league if he hasn't already. I really don't know if he's been disciplined at all, but I'm sure there's going to be a phone call, a fine, or something like that levied against Chris Paul. But they were saying, or people are saying, Scott Foster not be allowed to ref Chris Paul games. And as I say on every podcast that I talk about the NBA one cares about its players, but the NBA is the one sport that has to always fight against a different narrative. That's why I think Adam Silver has the toughest job amongst commissioners of leagues. But the NBA, because it's such an intimate sport, the image of the NBA is more fragile than baseball. Fans away from the players. Football, fans away from the players. And I talked a couple of weeks ago, if a fight broke out in football, a fight breaks out in baseball, fights break out in hockey, it's a different narrative. It's almost just kind of assumed that those things happen. A fight breaks out in the NBA, it is personal, it is up close. The NBA has a different pressure sensor. The pressure on the NBA's image is more sensitive. The Malice in the Palace, and then what was the referee years ago, Donahue? the referee that was accused of betting, or he had some, you know, issues with gambling in the NBA. He was fired. But Scott Foster not reffing Chris Paul games just says something else. It's not that simple for him to just not ref games. If the NBA said, okay, Scott Foster, you can't ref any more Chris Paul games, you know what the NBA is also saying? That our referees are personally biased, that our referees have a tendency to have personal bias against players, and therefore they may have a tendency to make calls for players that they like, make calls against players that they don't like. If the NBA decides that Scott Foster and Chris Paul cannot be on the court together, they're saying something more. So that cannot happen. Because who's to say that there's not another referee that doesn't have a personal agenda against LeBron James? Who's to say that a referee doesn't have a personal agenda against Giannis Antetokounmpo? Who's to say that a referee doesn't have a personal agenda against Steph Curry? Right? I'm sure every player, and I'm not saying that the Chris Paul situation isn't real, but I'm sure there are lots of players who don't like certain refs. I'm sure that there are lots of refs that don't like certain players. And personal feelings do kind of get involved when it comes to refing games. If you see a guy who's a flopper, a referee kind of, he's aware, right? If a guy has a tendency to do certain things, whistles blow faster. Except in the case of Draymond Green, he can do anything. Dog cuss a ref. I don't care what Draymond does. The whistle seems to blow slower, and maybe it just blows quietly and nobody hears it. Draymond Green is the one guy who gets a pass with all referees. I don't know why. Again, Warrior organizational favor. See my last podcast. But if the NBA was to make that call, make that decision, they're admitting that they have a problem within their association. They're admitting that their referees cannot be unbiased and cannot call games properly, fairly. So if the NBA doesn't want an image issue, they already have one. They're trying to, man, I cannot imagine the scramble and the meetings and the Zoom calls that are taking place trying to clear this mess up. But if the NBA comes out and openly says Scott Foster would no longer be calling Chris Paul games, they're also admitting that our referees also have a tendency to be biased and call, plays and games that are unfairly just. They're not going to say that. Now, I'm not saying that Scott Foster's schedule won't fall out of line with wherever Chris Paul is playing. They may do some rearranging, but if one of their best referees, and Scott Foster is a playoff ref. Scott Foster's a playoff ref. So he must have a high enough scorecard for him to be placed in the postseason. And if Scott Foster is a playoff ref and Chris Paul is in the playoffs, he is likely going to run into Scott Foster at some point. The NBA isn't or cannot, in my opinion, go out of its way to try to keep the two separate. I think they will try to amend some scheduling to soften this until it blows over or to see where the Warriors end up. But if I have to guess, I would say Scott Foster will see Chris Paul again on the basketball court. Maybe there will be a meeting to kind of soften relationship, understanding. I think that is probably the most proper thing to do, is to have a mediator in this instance where a player feels personally attacked by a referee, because the referees control the game. We can't ignore that. The ref controls the game. The players are playing, the refs are calling, and to assume that a ref cannot impact the game is just silly. And if Chris Paul's record while Scott Foster is on the court with him looks suspicious, it might be suspicious. But it's another instance and situation where the NBA's hands are kind of tied. Unfortunately, Adam Silver has a hard job. You don't think that there are referees in other sports who see players and roll their eyes, or see teams and roll their eyes, and that the flag or the whistle doesn't blow for certain teams or against certain teams? These people are human beings. They're human beings. And for us to assume that a ref doesn't have a personal whistle in his pocket, or that an umpire on the football field doesn't have, or a ref doesn't have a personal flag in their pocket for players, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. But the revelation of it, the proof of it, if that starts to show its face, then that particular league's got a problem. You either got to fire Scott Foster, or you've got to admit something else. And they've not fired Scott Foster. There's not been any sort of justified ruling that Scott Foster has been unfair to any team that Chris Paul is on. I've not heard that. I've not seen or heard that Scott Foster refed games and Chris Paul played games when they are together have been unfairly refed, handled. I think it looks funny and it looks suspicious on paper. But who knows? Maybe it's Chris Paul who plays with a more anxiety's edge when Scott Foster's around. Maybe Chris Paul leans into, the narrative of let me see what he does. Maybe Chris Paul is a challenger. He's an aggravator. And so maybe he aggravates the games that Scott Foster is reffing. It's not unreasonable to believe that Chris Paul doesn't try to prove his point whenever Scott Foster's on the court. It's not unreasonable to assume that Scott Foster doesn't blow the whistle quicker when it's Chris Paul. But who's to say who's the lead aggravator in those situations? Nobody knows. It's not like Chris Paul isn't a chippy player. It's not like Chris Paul doesn't have a reputation for kind of going, above board sometimes with his sort of, ticky tack dirty play. Chris Paul has been called a kind of a cheap shot player. He's been called a cheap shot player. He's been called kind of a dirty player. That's a narrative that surrounds him, but he just polishes his image by participating on, with the Players Association and things like that. He has a polished image. Players respect him, but there are a lot of players who have played against Chris Paul and they don't like him. They don't like the way he moves on the basketball court. But any two ways the NBA starts to purposely separate the two, they're also admitting that we have a ref problem. Because are we just going to say it's Scott Foster? How many other players are going to come out and start pointing at referees and saying, well, since you're doing that, can you get this guy off my games? They can't open up that Pandora's box. They can't open up a can of worms for players to start pointing out referees. They have a personal bias against me and I don't want them on my game. So Chris Paul is going to have to, and whatever team Chris Paul is on, they're going to have to suck it up. I think they will try to amend scheduling to let this thing breathe, because you can't have them on the court anytime soon. The altercation that they had is too fresh. You can't have them on the court anytime soon. And there are enough games early in the season to kind of, let's dilute this a little bit. Let's dilute this. But I just believe the Warriors are typically a playoff team. They're going to come across Scott Foster at some point or another. And you better hope Chris Paul, you know, maybe the baby-faced assassin just kind of carries you over the threshold. But I'm not willing to say that Chris Paul doesn't lean into aggravating Scott Foster. Maybe he does. Chris Paul isn't an innocent player. He's calculating. I mean, he was a Rocket, so I don't have anything against him, but there is a narrative around him. And, but this is bigger than Scott Foster. This is bigger than Chris Paul. This is the NBA, its brand, and they've got to protect it. And they're not going to let a narrative about one of their referees, without it being absolute, like the Tim Donaghy scandal, without it being absolute, they are not going to admit that and just make sure that they are separated from basketball play. I don't believe that. Sometimes you just have to. Chris Paul, I mean, how many more years is Chris Paul going to play? Are you going to get rid of one of your top referees for an aging basketball player? No. I mean, they're both older. I don't know how old Scott Foster is. Is he close to retiring? I mean, Chris Paul, they're both kind of up in age, but I don't know how long Scott Foster's going to ref. I mean, we can kind of guesstimate Chris Paul will play 1 or 2 more years. Maybe they just kind of ride this wave out, right? Do any other players have any real issues with Scott Foster? I'm not sure. But I know that a lot of players do believe that there's something to this personal relationship, or do we want to call it personal relationship? This, a bad personal relationship. Personal. It's personal. Chris Paul said it's personal. Called him a bitch. I think he called him a bitch. It's personal. So it's no longer professional. It's personal. The NBA has a problem. Adam Silver, hardest job, in my opinion, in professional sports. Hardest job. Keeping the NBA image off the floor, out of the dirt, with the likes of antics, Ja Morant, antics, twirling guns, Draymond Green dragging Rudy Gobert off the court, Chris Paul, Scott Foster, Russell Westbrook arguing with fans. The NBA is an up close and personal relationship. It is the most intimate. It is the most intimate of all the sports, and I'm trying to think. To be fair, I think so. Glass between hockey players and their fans, large fields between NFL players and their fans. Baseball, their fans are far enough away. The NBA is an intimate experience, and Adam Silver has the hardest job amongst all league commissioners, I believe. And so, what's he gonna do about this one? But I like the topic on Gil's Arena, but I just don't believe that the NBA is in position to admit that they have a problem with one of their refs' inability to call games properly, because you're opening up a can of worms. And so I think players, from their perspective, think it's easy. But Adam Silver's job is not easy. So, what do we think about that? Let's get into the comments. Please click like if you like the video, if you like my take on this, if you are interested in the channel. Of course, you're interested in the channel. Go ahead and click the subscribe button. But Tiffany Gaines, host of the Secrets Podcast, Chris Paul and Scott Foster. It's not an easy solution. I appreciate your time. Peace.